Welcome back to Urology 101. I'm James Farrell, and today we're going to start off with some of the upper tract anatomy because anatomy is really important from a surgical standpoint. It's our roadmap. But also, anatomy is going to be important for patients because I think that it really does help them understand where some of the problems are, what some of the considerations are when we talk about surgeries, where some of the pain may come from, and just a little bit better understanding of everybody's body. So I think that it's really helpful to go through this for a couple minutes. In some of the future podcasts, we will refer back to it, and I hope it's helpful for that too. So when we talk about the upper tract anatomy, neurology tends to be divided into upper tract and lower tract. When we talk about the upper tract anatomy, we mostly are talking about kidneys, something called the adrenal glands, the ureter, and then everything down the ureter until we get to the bladder. And the bladder really starts to talk about some of the lower urinary tract anatomy. So what we're going to start with is a model of the kidneys. And this right here is our kidney. And right here, we call that the adrenal gland. Now, renal and kidney are the same thing. So if there's one problem that's really annoying about medicine, it's that we have 5 names for every single thing. So kidney and renal are the same. Because this is above the renal gland, it got called adrenal, so adrenal gland. The adrenal gland is responsible for all kinds of important stuff. One thing is the fight or flight response, so adrenaline comes from the inside of the middle of that guy. Our normal stress response when we feel distress, so cortisol, that comes from this. The ability to reabsorb salt in our body, something called mineralocorticoids, that's a class of hormones that aldosterone fits into. And then also for women, the large majority of testosterone comes from the adrenal glands. But for guys, only about 10% comes from that. The other 90% comes from the testicles. So when we talk about the kidney, we do talk about the adrenal gland above it, and then the kidney proper here, and this is what it looks like. It does look like a kidney bean. Obviously, that was named well. And we talk about what's called the renal hilum. So this is the renal artery, that's a renal vein. You can have multiple of each, which can make it a little tricky sometimes surgically, but people can have multiple because when the kidneys are developing in a baby, they start low in the pelvis actually, and then they travel up farther as a baby elongates. And so the branches of the arteries go away and then new ones come up, and then sometimes that's how you end up with multiple arteries, multiple veins in somewhat strange configurations sometimes. But most people, what we're talking about, will have an artery, one vein, and they'll have one what's called ureter. And if we look at the back side of the kidney, the ureter is usually behind the vascular anatomy, and the renal pelvis, this thing, sits right here. And then if we look inside the kidney, what you tend to see are these open areas in here, and this is called the collecting system. So when blood flows in through this artery, in and around what we call the cortex, which is out here, the blood goes through the kidney decides what fluid is going to stay in the body and go back in through the renal vein to the rest of the body, or is that fluid, going to become what we call urine, which the body doesn't need anymore, and it goes into these areas called collecting systems. And then that goes into this, which is the renal pelvis, down the ureter, and down through the ureteral orifice into the bladder, and then that makes the lower urinary tract system. These parts become very important when we talk about stones, because stones can form in multiple parts in the kidney, and then they can get into the the collecting system. They ultimately can get into the ureter, but they can be in different parts of the collecting system, and different surgical options are important based on the size of a stone and where the stone is. And we'll talk about that in another video. So that's really the anatomy up here. This is a different representation of it. All right, let's get that. This is the same thing again. So one kidney on each side. Most people will have 2 kidneys. Some people only have 1, but most people have 2. Most people have 1 ureter on each side. Almost everybody will have 1 adrenal gland on each side. Don't pay any attention to this. That's me talking with a patient about a tumor. But this is the cortex up here. And then, again, blood flows through all of this, can get into the collecting system, which is here, here, and here, and then get into the ureter and travel down in through what's called the ureteral orifice into the bladder. Now, the ureters are muscular tubes. And they're pretty long because your kidney starts way up here. So if I stand up, your kidney is back here under some of your ribs. And then it has to get all the way down to the pelvis. How does the ureter get there? Well, it travels through the back.